Good morning and welcome to the Middle East Forum's monthly special program, the Forum Roundtable. My name is Laurie Regan, and I'm privileged to host these important panel discussions with the world's leading experts on critical foreign policy and national security issues of the moment. This month, we will be discussing something very much on the top of our minds these days: Islamism, Israel, and the decline of Western civilization. Everyone's familiar with the phrase, "What begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews," or as Mark Stein recently wrote, "Dead Jews are ever and always merely the warm-up act for dead infidels more generally. Islam prefers to be king on a field of corpses." As we witness an unprecedented rise of anti-Semitism across the entirety of the West, from North America, both in Canada and the U.S., to the vast majority of Western European countries and throughout Australia, it's difficult not to notice a common denominator: the rise and infiltration of radical Islam on the shores of these nations. For the Islamists, Jews are the starting point, a global caliphate is the goal, and Christians remain in the crosshairs. Yet, as this movement metastasizes, Western leaders seem completely unaware, incapable of addressing, or outright supportive of immigration policies, criminal statutes, and free speech rights that are fueling the demise of our own civilizations. In our panelist, Josh Hammer's new book, Israeland Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West, a copy of which I have, he makes the case that Israel and the Jewish people are central to Western civilization itself, and that the anti-Israel movements across the world are threatening the physical and metaphysical survival of the West and its Judeo-Christian heritage. Joining us to discuss this premise, as well as the numerous threats seeking to undermine the Judeo-Christian values and culture that have allowed Western civilization to flourish in modern times, are three brilliant and influential thinkers: Josh Hammer, senior editor-at-large of Newsweek and host of The Josh Hammer Show; Danielle Pletka, distinguished senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute; and Lee Smith, journalist, author, and writer for Tablet Magazine. I urge you all to follow their important work at their websites and on social media, as they're all prolific, wise, and insightful. Today's podcast is being recorded and will be available for viewing, so please do share the recording far and wide, as I couldn't think of a more important discussion, given where we are today, than the one we're about to have with our brilliant panelists. So welcome to Josh, Danny, and Lee, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to start with Josh. In the introduction to your book, Josh, you note, quote, "The truth is that the explosion of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of the Simchat Torah massacre, as you've coined the October 7th attack, actually says very little about the Jewish people and the Jewish state of Israel, but it says a lot, on the other hand, about the ailing, sordid state of America and the broader West." You go on to write, "What history has shown us time and again is that when things start to go south in a given society, the Jews are typically the first scapegoats. Anti-Semitism is the shape-shifting chameleon of bigotries, constantly warping and transmuting to fit the malady of the day." Can you share with us, Josh, what is going on in Western society that is once again leading to unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism that seemingly have become so common that they're almost expected, like the Yom Kippur attack in Manchester, England, that wasn't really a surprise to anybody? I mean, we have historical perspective with regards to the Nazi scapegoating of German Jews and the European Jewry more broadly, but the global anti-Semitism genie has been let out of the bottle in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. And Israelis were the victims in that case. So this all seems pretty incomprehensible. And as Danny would say, what the hell is going on?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. So the question, if I understand correctly, is essentially why this is happening right now, right? And there's a few ways to tackle that question. The Jews, this is not exactly a novel insight that I'm about to say on this conversation, but the Jews are the perennial canaries in the coal mine. They are the perennial symptoms of a broader societal, national, or civilizational rot, and this literally goes back all the way to the Bible. I mean, in many ways, the first ever instance of historically recorded Jew hatred, Jewish of the Jewish people, simply for the sake that they are Jewish people. You might argue that the first ever instance of Jew hatred is the oppression of the Israelites in Pharaoh's court in the first few chapters of the book of Exodus, and in that particular case, it was actually a precursor of imminent doom, of the downfall of Pharaoh, and there's been a trend that has continued each and every time that there has been a rise of Jew hatred throughout history. In fact, I would suggest that you would have to do a lot of thinking to come up with a single example of a country that has turned on its Jewish population and been better due to the fact that it turned on its Jewish population. It's funny. I was giving a somewhat similar presentation to a Stanford University group made 2-3 weeks ago. And a professor actually gave me an interesting historical example. He said, well, what about England? England expels the Jews in the late 13th century, and they reached kind of the heights of British Empire there. Okay, I mean, like maybe you could say that there was some sort of correlation. There's obviously not a causation there. And frankly, for what it's worth, I think that England actually even got only stronger after the 17th century kind of philo-Semitic English Puritans really kind of got the... Anyway, I'm really getting in the weeds here. The point is that there is really very little to no instances of Jew hatred indicating anything other than broader malaise and decay and rot. So when I see something like 33 Harvard University student groups that affixed this letter while the blood was still drying in the Gaza envelope after the Hamas pogroms, essentially saying that the Jews of Israel are themselves morally culpable for their own slaughter, my very first thought as someone analyzing the situation is that we're not just dealing here with a bunch of young idiots, which we obviously are dealing with, but there's something that fundamentally has gone wrong at a higher level. At a higher level that has led to the purportedly most prestigious university in the world having 33 student groups affix their names to this there. And in the book Israeland Civilization, I basically lay out the stakes and the parameters of a civilizational clash between the West, which I identify as being largely synonymous with the biblical inheritance, the Judeo-Christian West, with the inheritance of Jews and Christians alike. And then you have the forces of non-civilization, the forces of barbarism there. And there's at least three different buckets, three different categories of barbarians, of various shades of barbarism, of actual outright instinct toward violence and so forth there. And on the one hand, we definitely have Islamism, which is, of course, the strand of barbarism that the world saw with its own eyes on October 7th, that America saw on 9/11, and that we just see coming up time and time again. So Islamism is definitely one of the anti-civilizational strands of barbarism and subjugation. There is wokeism, or left-wing neo-Marxism, which is a somewhat softer form of intellectual tyranny and anti-Western civilizational totalitarianism. But basically, the woke claim, it kind of takes the old Marxist argument and it kind of flips it on script and says, no, it's not necessarily for present purposes the case that there are the oppressed and oppressor classes when it comes to economics, the patricians, the plebeians, the proletariat. No, rather there are oppressed and oppressor classes when it comes to various intersectional identity traits. And it just so happens that according to this somewhat arbitrary rubric, that the Jewish people, the world's most historically oppressed group of people, somehow fall on the oppressor side of the dichotomy. Don't ask me how they get there, but that is what they choose. So you have the Islamists, you have the woke neo-Marxists, and then to an extent as well, you have, in the book what I argue are the global neoliberals. I mean, we might even just say globalists. And some people think that globalism is something of, maybe even an anti-Semitic buzzword, and maybe there are some people for whom it is, but I think it is a real word with real meaning, and I mean it to be the opposite of nationalism or globalism, essentially a universalist ideology. Because the secret sauce of the Jewish people, really going back all the way to the days of Abraham leaving his hometown in Parsha Lech Lecha, Genesis chapter 12. I mean, the secret sauce of the Jewish people is our particularism. It is not our universalism, but our particularism and our nationalism. And the way that plays out in contemporary geopolitics, among other ways, thinking about just the capital S state of Israel, is I have long suspected that one of the reasons that the United Nations and various other transnational tribunals so clearly and viciously have the state of Israel in their crosshairs, a lot of it is just simple hatred of Jewish people for the sake that they are Jews. But I think that there is something broader going there, which is that Israel represents the paradigm of a particular nationhood, and has been that way, again, literally since biblical times, since King David unites the tribes of Israel and literally forms the first nation state. I mean, what we might call a nation state with real borders and no extraterritorial ambitions. In fact, the biblical nation state model is actually in contrast to the Roman imperial model. So if you believe in the nation state, in a world that is better ordered by nations, and if you are opposed to the kind of the John Lennon imagined globalist utopia, then I think that is doing a lot of the work there as well. So, Laurie, I could go on. I guess I'll just stop there. But I think it's a combination of these three ideologies that have been ascendant, certainly in the American Academy. Woke neo-Marxism ever since the Frankfurt School in the 1960s is probably kind of most easiest to point to there. When it comes to bloodshed, I think Islamism would be easiest to point to. When it comes to geopolitics in the world stage, I think globalism would be easier to point to.
Thank you, Josh. I know that we could spend a lot of time talking, but we do have a lot to cover, so I appreciate that comprehensive answer. And I'm going to turn to Danny. As Josh pointed out, what we're seeing, Danny, in the West could be called a clash of civilizations. It's not just Western countries which have imported populations who don't wish to assimilate and become productive members of their new host countries, but it's also the leftist, Marxist, and homegrown terrorist supporters, as Josh pointed out. And there's this also sort of philosophy, the Obama mentality of they wish to fundamentally transform America. And the leftists who are seeking to rewrite history are doing so with projects like the 1619 Project, that America was founded by a bunch of white people seeking a home for their slaves, brainwashing generations of kids that that white men are evil, they're oppressors. And in this world, the narrative of Zionism is racism is in fact a truism. Can you discuss the Red-Green Alliance and if it's possible to fight back against these very insidious ideas they put forth that have infected, at least, as I said, a generation?
So thank you for having me, Laurie, first of all. And look, I can't disagree with Josh. He put a great deal out there, and I think we'll be well served to sort of pull on all those various threads. I can't begin to pull on the biblical thread since I have about somewhat less biblical knowledge, I suspect, than he does. But look, we need to start, I think, with ourselves, because as one of my former bosses liked to say, I think something that applies to almost everything: you can't beat something with nothing. And what we have now is a vacuum that has been filled, right? It's not as if we were all standing around singing "God Bless America," pledging allegiance to the flag, going to church, remaining married to the first person who we betrothed, having lots of children, and otherwise believing in God and country. That's not who we are anymore. And if we are not those people in America, we can for sure underscore that Europe is way ahead of us. That in fact, in Europe, both marriage, but also belief in God, but also church attendance, synagogue, whatever it is, that those things have disappeared from public life. And that's not a way to lecture people, you should be going to synagogue. This is not about that. It's about understanding. And my former boss at AEI, Arthur Brooks, has written extraordinarily well on this question of faith, family, and community. Because in the absence of faith, family, and community, what do? We go and search for substitutes. Right. And if I want to be intellectual and snobby, we can talk about Arthur Koestler and The God That Failed. Right. Because this was his coming of age book about the bankruptcy of communism, the bankruptcy of Marxism. Right. Because, in fact, what these ideologies are, in essence, are religions that substitute for what was once actually just, religion. Now, we can't say that about Islam. And while there are certainly plenty of Muslims who do not go to mosque, who do not fast on Ramadan, who do not pray to Mecca 5 times a day, the reality is that there are an enormous number of them, particularly in the European Union, who are observant, and even when they are not observant, adhere to the ideology that goes along with extremist Islamism. And the weird thing, of course, is, and there's been a lot written about this, and there are a lot of people who are doing an outstanding job chronicling this. My friend Chris Caldwell, who wrote really one of the first books on the Red-Green Alliance that you talk about, but Dominic Green, who writes for The Spectator, National Review, and others, who's writing about the growing intolerance of the United Kingdom. But the irony is, of course, this is not the people who immigrated in the aftermath of colonialism, right? This is not the people who came in 1950, 1955, who went to Australia or went to the UK, from India, from Pakistan, from North Africa. It is their children. Okay? And that is because our societies have changed and these ideologies have infiltrated. And so what you see, for me, this is all epitomized by that sad, disturbed girl, Greta Thunberg, right? And we should not call her anything else, okay? Because she's mentally not okay. And this has become her mission, in the same way that people who are obsessive and have psychosis embrace a mission. But she started out as an environmentalist extremist, and now she is an Islamist extremist, an anti-Semite, pro-Hamas, right? Leading these absolutely ridiculous and pointless flotillas to Gaza, bringing no food and merely a whole bunch of, European sheepish leftists. So, but why does this come together? Josh used the right word, and it's much more of a political word than it is a religious word, but it is a substitute for religion, and that is this intersectionality, right? Once upon a time, you could be pro-choice and pro-Israel. You could worry about climate change, and you could believe that we shouldn't have reparations for slavery. Now, as my friend and co-host of our show, Elise Labott, likes to say, you've got to buy the package. Right? And it is the package that is so insidious. This is why when you go to Harvard, when you go to Stanford, when you go to Manchester, when you go to London, I'd say more than 50% of the people marching there have no idea what the hell they're talking about, right? They're there because this is their God, because this is their substitute, because they are ignorant, and because they have bought the package, right? Queers for Palestine. Queers for Palestine and Greta Thunberg are the exact same thing, right? Ignorance in action, but perfervid belief. And of course, the Islamists, and I'll wrap up right here, probably not in any way answering your question, but certainly babbling effectively. The Islamists are, look, these guys are good at their jobs. And that may offend some people who know that the Muslim Brotherhood, that the Ikhwan, these are terrorists, that they support the murder of Jews, that they are about the hostages, they are about what happened on October 7th, and more broadly, Iran and everything else that's going on. But at the end of the day, they have strategic patience. We get bored very easily, the rest of us. They are very intelligently aligning themselves with the morons who want to side with them and who will go out and march, the ones who will take their side, the ones who are going and bullying young Jews in the street, the ones who are bullying Jewish professors, the ones who are trying to kill Jews that they see in Paris and in London, right? The Manchester murderer, right? Hamas. Because it's not just these lone wolves, this is organized, right? This is the problem. They have latched themselves onto the Haley. They have latched themselves onto their supporters in a very intelligent and a very strategic way. And I think the real question is actually not for them, because they know what they're doing. The real question is for the rest of us. How do we answer this question? How do we provide that? How do we beat that something with something else? What is that something else? How do we gather our forces, the forces of what we like to call Western civilization? Democracy, belief in God, belief in civil society and rule of law, in the rights of women, in the rights of minorities, all those things that none of these people sign up for. How do we take that back and stand up for what we believe in? And I think that conversation remains very, very much ongoing. And I don't think that there is a single unified, satisfying answer to that. And that in and of itself is troublesome because, of course, their answers are all easy. Hold up a flag, talk about global warming, talk about famine and jihad, pretend that Francesca Albanese is a goddess, and move forward. What are we doing? So I'm going to let Lee answer that question, and maybe you'd like to ask one too, Lori.
Well, actually, you sort of did ask the question that I was going to turn to Lee about. I'll just sort of add to what you've said, which is, Lee, I want to turn to the U.S. in particular because we look at Minneapolis and Dearborn, and the call to prayer is now projected across those cities. The Muslim mayor of Dearborn told a white citizen that he was no longer welcome there and to leave. I mean, these people, they hate capitalism, they hate American exceptionalism, and they scapegoat Jews. We've got, Mahmoud Khalil, who has a whole following, and hopefully he'll be, deported from the country. But, he hates America. The People's Conference of Palestine, a week or two ago, there was a professor who talked about destroying the idea of America. We've got professors, we've got imams in the mosques. So what do we do, Lee? Is there a way, if these people, is demography destiny? If the Islamists that have moved into the country are not assimilating, and they have a different idea of the direction of where America should go, what do we do about this?
Well, I think first of all, thanks. Sorry for being late. And Lori, thank you for inviting me. And hi, Danny. Hi, Josh. Nice to be on this great panel with you. And hi to your great Middle East Forum audience. I think the one thing is that the Trump administration needs to make this the core of its deportation campaign. They need to get rid of Mohsen Madawi. They need to get rid of Mahmoud Khalil. All these different guys. They need to get rid they need to get rid of Palestinians. They need to get rid of Palestinian terror supporters. They need to get rid of Palestinian terrorists. Mohsen Madawi virtually boasts about his family members who are part of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. He entered this country by crossing into Israel illegally. And that's how he got his visa. I mean, this is outlandish. This is what the Trump administration has to focus on. So the first thing that has to be seen is that that none of this corresponds with American values or American interests. So this is the first thing that needs to happen. They need to be knocked back, right? It's going to be very, very hard at this point to deport every Hezbollah supporter who carries an American passport in Dearborn, Michigan. That's going to be very hard. The people who did that, though, the people who let them in, the different charities and the different U.S. officials who were responsible for these actions, though, they can be held responsible for what they did, especially the different charities, right? The different religious charities, and they span the sectarian divide. So whether we're talking about Lutherans, Catholics, Jewish charities, all of these different organizations must pay a very serious price, and they must be prevented from doing this ever again. So that's the most crucial way to do it. Look, but our bigger problem here is not. It's not just the Islamists, it's the left, right? I mean, that's really who's out there. That's really who's out there filling the streets of American cities. And look, we also have to realize we have a very big problem on the right too. And part of this problem on the right is, look, what happened earlier this week on October 7th. We had people filling the streets of New York City to celebrate the largest massacre of Westerners since 9/11. I'm talking about October 7th. So we had Islamists, we had Muslims, we had Arabs out there with leftists, right? But what was the big news on social media? Well, maybe Josh has already talked about this, or Josh has been targeted, put in the middle of this. But the idea that that Candace Owens is forcing people on social media to talk about Jews. I mean, to fake stories about Jews. I mean, it's obvious what was going on. This is the most important story. These animals are filling our streets. They're celebrating murder, rape, torture, and kidnapping. But no, but Candace Owens and other people ostensibly on the right demand that instead we talk about Jews. So that's a very big problem, and this is actually something that we can very actively take a role in dismantling here in the United States. The people on the right who appear to be defending and supporting and covering for Islamists and leftists.
So you actually, Lee, answered a question that I was going to ask you in a little while, which was about right-wing anti-Semitism. No, that's good, because we'll cover it maybe a little bit more in depth in a couple minutes. But Josh, I want to turn back to you and see if you can spend some time talking about Israel and Jewish nationalism and the role that it plays in the survival of the West. You've touched on the three forces that you see threatening the West. But why is a strong America-Israel relationship so critically important to the West's survival? And what role does the Christian community play in this battle? It's a community that, I'll add, that is also being attacked by the Islamists the world over. In this context, are you concerned about the declining support among young Americans for Israel, which includes younger evangelicals as well? And I'll just add that, I don't think anybody would argue that Israel is no longer a partisan issue. It is absolutely a partisan issue, and it's the Democrats who have turned away from it. So how concerned should we be about that as well?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. And, first, let me just quickly allude to what my good friend Lee Smith was saying, because it does also relate to what you were just saying, Lori, which is I am increasingly of the opinion that it no longer does us a good service to refer to Israel as a quote-unquote partisan issue. And what I mean by that is because there was a period of time where the right was pretty much in lockstep in support of tight-knit U.S.-Israel relations. And for, call it a 10, 15-year period there, while the right was in lockstep, while the post-2008, post-Barack Obama intersectional Democratic Party coalition was really taking over the party, the left was certainly incredibly hostile. Now, the latter has not changed, okay? The latter has obviously not changed at all. If anything, it has metastasized. It has gotten considerably worse. One need only look at people like Zohran Mamdani, now on the cusp of taking over the mayoral reins of the most important city in America, if not the world. But I don't want to do the whole full, Tucker Candace thing right now, but that is the reason I was a little tardy for this Zoom call. I've been on the phone with lawyers and security consultants and detectives and the feds and the states and you name it, because I was thrust into this absolute insanity there. And the insanity this week does relate a little bit to the youth question, which is what you actually asked me about, Lori, there, for the following reason, which is that Charlie Kirk, I think, has to be mentioned here and has to be discussed at least a little bit. So I was a friend of Charlie's. We were in virtually daily contact for the final year and a half of his life. In fact, I didn't actually realize this until my wife pointed out to me after he was tragically assassinated, but I was actually on stage for the final ever Turning Point USA event that Charlie Kirk ever hosted at a conference. That was the debate between me and Dave Smith at the conference in July. And now there has been a lot of hair pulling, and some of it is justified when it comes to the polling, when it comes to the younger generations, younger millennials and Gen Z, Republicans, Trump supporters on this issue. I don't want to sound the 5-alarm fire necessarily. I do think it is worth pointing out that at that conference that I spoke at, debated at in July, the Turning Point Student Action Summit in Tampa, Florida, they did a push poll on a series of questions to all the 4,000, give or take, attendees there, much younger high school, college-age audience, and 73% of the crowd called themselves pro-Israel. Now, is it true that a Turning Point USA summit would have been 90%, 95% pro-Israel as recently as 5-7 years ago? Probably true, but 73% is not horrible. It's something to work with. For what it's worth, 86% of the attendees said that they supported President Trump's strike on the Iran nuclear facilities, the 37-hour Operation Midnight Hammer operation with the B-2 bombers at Fordow. And so that got 86% approval rating there. So, I think to an extent this narrative that the younger generation, at least right of center, is lost, is somewhat overstated. Now, there are real challenges, and this is actually a lot of my day-to-day work, both publicly. This is my friendship with Charlie, my involvement with the National Conservatism Conference, and our efforts to build alliances between Jews and Christians. You know, there are very interesting things happening when it comes to younger Christians in America, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I guess I would just note this. Long story short, the form of specifically Protestant theology that was really ascendant during the days of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and the moral majority going back to the 1970s, 1980s, the theology that really kind of built CUFI, Christians United for Israel, under Pastor John Hagee, into a formidable force in Washington, was a form of theology based largely on Book of Genesis promises. You know, Genesis 12:3, this notion that God will bless those who bless the children of Israel and curse those who curse them. It was really ascendant. Part of the challenge for many of us younger activists is that specific theology is kind of laughed out of the room by a lot of younger conservative Christians. I couldn't give you a full disquisition as to why exactly that is. I'm a religious Jew, not a religious Christian. I don't have my thumb that much kind of on the scale there, but I can just tell you that is my overwhelming experience there. So a lot of these efforts for kind of reminding the younger generations of the importance of this alliance have to come on other grounds. And that's part of what I do in my book, Israeland Civilization, as well. I have a whole chapter in the book, Chapter 7, which is singularly solely dedicated to making the case for U.S.-Israel relations through an America first, let's call it even a MAGA, Trumpian prism, where I kind of eschew, moralism and I eschew ideologies, and I make a very, very practical, realist, hands-on, nitty-gritty case for that alliance. And the Trump administration, both the first and second time around, to their credit, I think really gets this. The whole kind of first-term Middle East diplomacy, the series of events that ultimately culminated in the Abraham Accords of September 2020, I think really evince this quite well. If you think about geopolitics from a realist perspective, then the first thing that you should understand is that America, by definition, has limited resources, as any nation state has limited resources. And if you accept the natural corollary that our number one foe is the Chinese Communist Party, then the question arises, well, what does America do when it comes to other theaters of the world that are not the Indo-Pacific when it comes to securing our very real interests there? Well, the insight that I think led to the Abraham Accords is that what you seek to do is you seek to bring in various countries, maybe led by one strong country, in this case that would be Israel, to really then secure and patrol that region in a way that redounds to your own national interest. I was recently meeting with a U.S. senator on the Hill. I won't say who it was for purposes of confidentiality. And I kind of explained to the senator that here's my very kind of nitty-gritty quick test for defining what an ally is. Tucker Carlson has this ridiculous clip, like, an ally, what is an ally? Meanwhile, he calls Qatar an ally, but I digress. So anyway, what I said to this senator was, here's an ally. An ally is a country that when it acts to defend its own national interest, so the ally is acting avowedly of its own national interest, in pursuit of its own national interest, then your country benefits as a secondary or tertiary effect. That is a very easy way to think of what an ally is. This is the whole theory of the Abraham Accords. And I'll stop after this, but, there's so many ways you can see this play out. On a day-to-day basis, of course, Israel's various fights against radical jihadists, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, et cetera, these are virtually all U.S.-recognized foreign terrorist organizations. Hamas was recognized in 1997 during the second Clinton administration, for goodness sake. But just a super quick example, and I'll cut myself off after that, to really drive home this point that when Israel acts in its own interest, it really is benefiting America. On the months-long road that kind of culminated in the assassinations of Hassan Nasrallah in the Beirut, Lebanon bunker last September, and then a couple weeks after that, Yahya Sinwar in Gaza, Israel took out two Hezbollah jihadis by the names of Fuad Shakur and Ibrahim Akil. Now, this is a very knowledgeable audience on Islamism, so it's entirely possible that you know who Fuad Shakur and Ibrahim Akil are, but if you don't, they are essentially the masterminds of the 1983 Beirut barracks bombings and the U.S. Embassy bombing that same year that murdered 240 plus and 65 to 70, give or take, people respectively. Those two individuals had a U.S. State Department bounty on their head of $5 and $7 million respectively for like 4 decades, and nothing happened. until the IDF took them out. I literally cannot think of a crisper example as to how Israel acting in its own national interest serves the American national interest than that.
Thank you. I appreciate the insightful answer because that was a packed question and you covered everything. So I appreciate that, Josh. Danny, you did start talking about Western Europe in the response to the first question that I posed to you, but I want to get into it a little bit more. In the UK, you probably have more Muslim mayors of towns and cities, including London, than non-Muslim. I mean, Jews, as we know, are no longer safe in the UK. The Manchester shul attack is one example, but what followed that, I think, was pretty astounding, which was right after the pro-Palestinian rallies across the country celebrating the murder of Jews was just a horrific scene. And we know that Jewish citizens can't even wear a kippah and walk through the streets without being told by police that they're being provocative. So the UK, to me, seems like it's done. We've got Jews fleeing France en masse, and the Muslim population there runs amok. Italy, we saw 2 million people take to the streets across the country to protest Israel for intercepting the flotilla that we discussed earlier. Sweden, Belgium, Spain, the Netherlands, on and on. Islamists now seem to have more influence over European government policies than any other demographic in those countries. They're having babies, as you pointed out earlier. The West is not. So to that end, is what's going on in Western Europe reversible? Do you believe that that there could be anything to reverse course? And what is the likelihood that America would experience the same fate at some point in the future?
Okay. A, you have asked me the single hardest question that you have posed to anybody, which is how do we fix this? I, funnily enough, sat through lunch with my husband having exactly this conversation. And look, the problem is, again, I hate to keep coming back to us. Josh is talking about this a little bit. Obviously, Leah's done a lot of work in this space as well. But if we don't fix our education system, right? If we don't fix our immigration system, if we don't fix our sense of purpose, and instead we allow ourselves to be defined by occasional hostile events by outsiders, we're in a lot of trouble. And that's what's happened in Europe. So just to start with Europe, again, you cannot separate out economic questions from military questions, from alliance questions, from other issues, from immigration, right? Because in each case, it is not that the challenge, the problem by itself looks exactly like a problem, right? Social welfare. Is social welfare a good thing? Social welfare is a good thing, right? A good society is defined by looking after those most in need. Is the social safety net a safety net that should hold half of your population? Is it an excuse not to work? Okay. And again, you say, Danny, what the hell does that have to do with any of this? And the answer, of course, is it has everything to do with all of this. If you have an education system that doesn't teach what happened in World War II, but only focuses, let me just pick my own Fairfax County, Virginia, but focuses instead almost exclusively on the history of slavery and injustice. Right, to the point, and some people will remember this. I trot this story out about once every 5 years when my youngest daughter, who's now a senior in college, was in second or third grade, and she raised her hand and asked her teacher, who was well educated by Virginia Tech, one of our public universities, ma'am, why is it that we spend almost all our time talking about slavery, but you never talk at all about the Holocaust? And she looked at Nikki and said, Nikki, in our public schools, we don't talk about religion. Okay. Let me tell you, if these are the people educating your children, are you surprised that they, A, don't know what from the river to the sea means, that Palestine never existed, that any of these issues, whether it's everything from capitalism to globalism to anything else, it's no surprise. And of course, the European system is far ahead of the American system in this way. If you want to take tolerance of other people, which is a wonderful thing, right? We all should have tolerance for people who are different from us. I, as a Jew, love the idea, right, that people in the cause that we believe in are Muslims, are Christians, are Jews, are Black, are white, are Asian. I love that, okay? But if you take that idea to its extreme, as, for example, my native Australia has done, then nobody learns English, right? Then nobody is an Australian or French or British or American. They are all hyphenated, but they're not really hyphenated, right? Because which of you guys saw Hassan Piker yesterday, that absolute scumbag anti-Semite on Twitch, talk about how much he hated America? 2 Americans, right? That is, at the end of the day, the outgrowth of this. And unfortunately, if you bring these things together with the untrammeled immigration, and again, should we have taken in refugees from Syria? I mean, again, I have always been an advocate. I am an immigrant. I believe, and my parents and my grandparents were refugees. I am a big believer. But is everybody a refugee? And when they come, should they assimilate? And should they be forced to speak our language, learn our ways, and learn our culture? And if they are not, like the 1 million Syrians that Angela Merkel took in, do they not, at the end of the day, constitute exactly what people accuse Jews so often of being, which is a fifth column in favor of other ideas that are antithetical to our own? So, when you ask me, Lori, very unfairly, what it is that we should do about it, the answer is we need to fix immigration. We're starting to do that in our country, but let me tell you, we are not persuading. Right? Donald Trump is doing it by hook or by crook, but the left is still on the other side. And if a Democrat is elected as the next president, he or she will reverse this. In Europe, you're seeing conservatives like Friedrich Merz in Germany and certain programs, right? And certain programs that allow refugees, terrorists, in some cases, fast track to German citizenship. But that's not enough. And the problem is that there is an entire global infrastructure that is fighting us. What is wrong with the UK? They left the European Union. Sorry, I'm ranting now, but they left the European Union, but they can't deport people. Why can't they deport people? Because they're still members of the European Court of Human Rights. Right. And one of the things that both Reform and the Tories have said is we're going to get out of the European Court of Human Rights. Why can't Giorgia Meloni deport people who are known terrorists from Italy? Because the European Court of Human Rights won't let her, because their own judicial system won't let her. And by the way, even if we get past all of that, we've got the corruption of the United Nations that is, again, in concert trying to reverse all of this. So the answer is we have to fight on every single front to fix these problems, but we have to do so, and I hate to sound like a squish here, but we have to do so with compassion for the individuals that actually are the exceptions in too many cases, the real refugees, the real asylees, the people who are really fleeing from the tyrannies abroad that need our help and our care and our values. And we need to remember our values. These are not easy things to do. And I know that people like Lee, people like Josh, people like me, and people like you guys at the Middle East Forum end up being called bigots and fascists for highlighting what we need to fix, which is incredible.
Thank you, Danny. Lee, I was going to ask you to talk a little bit more about the right-wing anti-Semitism that we're seeing, that both you and Josh raised in the context of the email controversy or the the whole Candace Owens disaster. But I actually, I mean, if you want to touch on that a little bit more, because I am concerned about what's going on the right and the divide that is occurring, or seemingly the people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson wish to instill on the right, which is a divide between support for Israel
I think first of all we should separate Marjorie Taylor Greene from Tucker Carlson. So Marjorie Taylor Greene is a particular political problem. What Marjorie Taylor Greene is angry about is she wanted Donald Trump's endorsement for Georgia, to run for the U.S. Senate seat in Georgia, and so I think that's a lot of what's motivating it. There's a lot of other stuff that's motivating it here. With Tucker Carlson and with Candace Owens, it's something different. And Danny was talking about, look, the next time they elect a Democratic president, the borders are going to be open again. Yes, exactly. That's the whole point. The point here is, there's a lot of people. Oh, are they getting paid by Qatar? Are they getting paid by who? Like, it doesn't matter, because what this operation is doing is it's pointing in the same direction that benefits foreign adversaries of the United States, including China, including Russia, including Iran, including the Palestinians, including Qatar. I think a lot of times when people talk about Qatar, yeah, Qatar's a big problem, but who the nation states that are at that most benefit from the United States being driven apart from its ally Israel, this is China. The nation state that has most experience driving paranoia in the United States with conspiracy theories is Russia. So while I think that Qatar is a problem, we should look at, it's bigger. It's bigger than just Qatar. It's China and Russia as well.
People are accusing or suggesting that Qatar is paying Tucker Carlson.
Right. And what I'm saying is that may be the case. I don't know. There's no evidence yet of that happening. What I'm saying is that there's a much bigger game at stake here than Qatar. Much bigger, right? Because the point is to look, it's to drive MAGA apart, right? What does that mean? Right now, Donald Trump is the head of the Republican Party. What happens if the Republican Party turns on itself and eats itself up, right? Remember how Donald Trump won in 2024. Donald Trump was shot in the face and he got up, right? Donald Trump inspired lots of people to show up and vote for him that otherwise don't show up. Kamala Harris got 75 million votes, perhaps the worst presidential candidate in American history, and she only had a little more than 100 days to campaign, right? So people who are saying now, oh, well, no one likes the Democrats again, and no one wants to return to that, they don't know what they're talking about. And when they say, oh, Gavin Newsom, look at what a mess he's made of California. Gavin Newsom is a hugely impressive candidate. He's a beautiful man. I imagine that the next president of the United States is going to be Gavin Newsom, right? Especially insofar as these influencers keep tearing at the right. What are they gambling on? They're gambling on, oh, well, no one is going to vote for Gavin Newsom. There's a lot of people who might just stay home. So that's the larger, there are a number of plays here. The one we're looking at right now regarding Israel is to drive the United States and Israel apart, to weaken America's position in the region. Israel will do fine, right? And this is one of the things that Ben Shapiro was asking Prime Minister Netanyahu, I believe, last week during some interview. Are you making plans for what might happen? I said, yes, of course we are. Right? That's what leaders of a nation state are supposed to do. What separating the U.S. from its crucial ally in the Middle East weakens the U.S. in a strategically vital part of the world. All people need to do is look at a map. It's like, wow, there's the Eastern Mediterranean. Wow, there's the Persian Gulf. Oh, look, there's the Red Sea. It looks like all these waterways are important. It's very good that we have Israel there, isn't it? So that's one of the things that's happening to drive the U.S. and Israel apart, which weakens the United States in the vitally strategic region. The other part of this play again is to weaken the Republican Party, and to make sure the Republican Party is hobbled going into 2026 and then 2028 as well. So that's just a broad outline of what's happening.
Thanks, Lee. Josh, I want to turn back to you for the role that the media is playing, since with your position at Newsweek, I think you're perfect to answer this question. So we've got an issue both with mainstream and social media, and the role that they play in developing the public's perception of the West, America, Israel, and Islam. And we Danny touched on this a little bit, but there seems to be this moral rot in, I wouldn't even say that journalism is still alive. I think it's a dead profession, as we would typically have defined it. But we've seemed to have journalists who were cheering on the decline of the West, the demise of Israel, demonization of America, and the murder of Jews. So what are your thoughts on Israel now is taking an initiative that Charlie Kirk actually had recommended to Bibi in a long letter, and I'm not going to quote from that letter, but Charlie was very concerned about public perception of Israel in America and the role that the media was playing in that. So it seems that Israel now has taken a page out of Charlie's playbook, or at least taken some of his advice. Can you discuss that, the role that the media plays and what Israel is now doing to sort of counter that?
Sure. Charlie wrote this letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu back in May. I was given access to it maybe in June or July or so. I read it at that time. It was pretty private, actually, until the day after Charlie's murder. I think it was Netanyahu himself who was on Fox News with Harris Faulkner, if memory serves, and he alluded to this letter, and that was the first time that I became aware that anyone had discussed it publicly. So it's now a matter of public record. The New York Post has printed out and whatnot. And he did have a lot of concerns about Israel's PR, for lack of a better word, about their inability to combat the extraordinarily pernicious and destructive lies and falsehoods and distortions that people seem to hurl at the Jewish state on a seemingly daily basis. I can't tell you exactly what measures the government of Israel is taking in response to that letter, or not taking in response to that letter. I do know a little more about what is happening than I would feel comfortable saying publicly, but I guess I'll just say that they're aware of the letter. Netanyahu was a fan of the letter, and we'll see what happens. But look, I mean, that's a somewhat separate concern, at least in my mind, from the issues of the American media and the Western media. Now, Israel should absolutely have kind of a young, sleek, camera-savvy, social media-savvy person who basically just, in very witty fashion is able to respond to the lies of the day. I mean, they essentially should have their Carolyn Levitt, which actually might have been the exact way that Charlie phrased it in that letter. I can't remember, but they absolutely should have their Carolyn Levitt. Now, Eilon Levy was that for a little while, right, after October 7th. But he's been gone for a while now, and the closest we have now is essentially Netanyahu himself. And your mileage may vary on the prime minister. There's all sorts of opinions to be had about him, but he's definitely, at a bare minimum, he is not of the demographic range. He's not of the generation, I think, that this kind of person that I have in mind should be. So they really do need kind of this younger spokesman. They probably should have an aggressive social media account. They absolutely need to be more on top of the narratives, finding it day in and day out. As far as American media goes, I mean, I'm not sure what there is to be said, frankly, that has not already been said a million times. I mean, virtually all these institutions, virtually all of them, are rotten to their core. There are some exceptions. I am happy with the fact, I'm delighted with the fact that I've been an employee of Newsweek, a legacy media brand here in the United States. I've been an employee now for 5.5 years, which is, I think if you had told me at the beginning that I'd be working here 5.5 years, I'm not sure I would have believed you, but here we are. I was hired initially, actually, sorry, for 4.5 years. I got the date wrong, but regardless, I was hired initially to run the op-ed section. We publish all sorts of conservative voices, and now I host my own show and so forth there. So look, I mean, Newsweek, our company is certainly absolutely dedicated to doing our best to hear all sides, present all perspectives there. But a lot of media companies are not like that there. I think Barry Weiss becoming the editor-in-chief of CBS News is a fascinating potential plot twist. With Larry Ellison of Oracle's son, David Ellison, being the new head honcho over at Paramount, making the splashy hire of Barry Weiss. Barry is a friend. I'm extremely curious, extremely excited to see what she's able to do with CBS News, which prior to her arrival there was arguably the single worst of all the major legacy broadcast networks. I mean, I think if you were to try to rank ABC, NBC, and CBS, which is not a particularly fun thing to do, they're all in many ways quite terrible. I think you can make an argument that CBS is actually the worst of the worst when it came to the 60 Minutes edited interview of Kamala Harris, when it came to Tony Dokapil on the morning show at CBS News last year, having to essentially do a Maoist struggle session after asking Ta-Nehisi Coates some tough questions about his viciously anti-Semitic, anti-Israel book. So Barry has her work cut out for her, but that'll be a fascinating kind of real-time experiment in how to reform an institution there. I mean, my basic answer when people ask me what to do about our media predicament, and this comes through with the pro-Israel valence and just the general valence, is twofold. It's just that we should, on the one hand, be trying to make inroads within legacy institutions that have vestigial credibility. That's essentially what I've been doing for 4.5 years now at Newsweek, and I think that's what Bari Weiss will be attempting to do with her revamp at CBS News. On the other hand, we do live in a day and age of alternative media. The Trump administration, to their great credit, has this whole kind of newfangled White House press pass, this new credentialing process for alternative media, for YouTubers, Instagrammers, and so forth there. And we absolutely have to be willing to play in that space as well. Again, really not just the pro-Israel space, but just the civilizational sanity space, right? Against the forces of civilizational arson, as I sometimes call it there. So it's an all the above strategy. It's trying to make inroads within vestigial existing legacy media, as well as trying to build new institutions and build new platforms and cultivate that talent as well.
Thanks, Josh. I am going to turn to Danny for a simpler question, Danny, although I think I'm saying that somewhat sarcastically. We have an issue with American Jews. I mean, I think that diaspora Jews in general have a different outlook on the world and life than Israeli Jews who are survivors. And here in America, we've got Jews that are supporting Zohran Mamdani as the next mayor, despite on October 7th, him calling Israel claims that it's committing war crimes and genocide, and wanting to abolish IRA and wanting to arrest Bibi and won't condemn globalize the Intifada and whatnot. We've got J Street, and we've got organizations even a lot worse than J Street. So really quickly, where are all the supposedly good Jews that are supposed to lead our legacy organizations and, are remaining quiet while all of this is happening? Are Jews going to stay asleep and wake up one day when it's a little too late and they've got to run and get their Israeli passports? What are your thoughts?
So that was an easier question, Lori. I'm delighted. I'm delighted that you turned down the ratchet for me and asked an easier question. Look,
I'm sorry.
The Jewish community. Look, and let me underscore. I'm a Middle East expert. When I talk about the Jewish community, I talk about the Jewish community as a Jew. I don't talk about the Jewish community as a think tank denizen. But the Jewish community has always, not just now, but also before the Holocaust, has always wanted to be a part of the society more than it has wanted to cleave together. And in many ways, it is a testament to our ability to survive that we embrace that luxury, right? If you asked the average New York Jew 5 years ago what was more important, supporting the state of Israel or supporting a right to abortion, what do you think they would have said? I can tell you what they would have said because I know, and it wasn't Israel. I think this has been a wake-up call for a lot of Jews, more in Europe than in America, but in America as well. And we see this by not just the investors who are voting with their feet and taking money away from Harvard and from MIT and from Yale and from others, but with Jews who are no longer applying in the same numbers to schools like Harvard and Yale, and instead going to schools like the one where two of my kids went, which is Vanderbilt, which is led by a terrific chancellor who is very alert, perhaps because he's German, to the issues of anti-Semitism and to the illegality of the claims for BDS and for everything else. But look, at the end of the day, this has been a long time coming, Laurie. When I left Capitol Hill a really long time ago, I was sounding the alarm about AIPAC, not because I don't love my friends at AIPAC, but because AIPAC was not an organization that was doing much more than sustaining itself over time. Right. And we saw that when it was faced up with the Iran nuclear deal of the Obama administration, that it wasn't able to bring the people together to defeat it. But the same is true. J Street is just another version. But the same is true for the Anti-Defamation League, right? Which sought to create a hit list of organizations that they called haters and racists and bigots merely because they were conservative. There is a rot at the heart of organized Jewish groups that needs to be reckoned with, and I will tell you frankly that many people don't want to have that conversation. Okay, I wrote a piece, and I'll end with this. I wrote a piece, not this year's cover for the summer in commentary, which I also wrote more about Qatar, but the previous year I wrote a piece about how we needed to change the law to fight anti-Semitism and to fight Hamas's supporters and terrorism supporters in America. I laid out what legislation we needed, what we need to do, all of the steps that are needed to be taken, all of the members who support it. It was a roadmap, if I can use that ugly word. It was a roadmap of what to do. Not a single thing has happened, including the incredibly low-hanging fruit of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which is the codification of an executive order written by Donald Trump and kept by Joe Biden. If we can't get the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act passed, we are not doing anything. And the first thing that is necessary is a very, very frank conversation among ourselves and our supporters about just what has happened to us and why it is we are now incapable of thinking straight about these challenges. So sad and hopeless answer, but I'm still working on it because apparently I have nothing better to do.
Oh, your work is very important, Danny. Lee, I'm going to ask you the last question because I noticed that you retweeted a comment from Amir Ohana, who is Speaker of the Knesset, in which he stated, quote, "As I have said repeatedly since October 7th, far from being a local struggle, this is a global battle between the forces of radicalism, extremism, and fundamentalism, and those of freedom, liberty, and democracy. Western civilization is under attack, and it's our duty to stand firmly together and win." So this has been an afternoon of discussing Islamism, Israel, and the survival of the West. Lee, can you end on how we can convince Americans that this battle isn't just one that's, on the shores or of a far overseas place, and that it's taking place right here at home?
Well, I encourage people to read my colleague David Samuels in Tablet from a couple of months ago when he wrote about how the Kaaba has been built at ground zero. And indeed, I read the story, and it's a brilliant story. David's a brilliant writer. I was down there in Lower Manhattan last weekend, and I was shocked walking around on a Friday night, and indeed, right near one of the pools where one of the tower, there are two pools there for the towers. There is a performing arts center, the Perlman Performing Arts Center, it's the Kaaba. They've rebuilt the Kaaba at ground zero. It's shocking to me how nearly a quarter of a century after 9/11, the different things that happened. For instance, New York is about to elect a man who believes in globalizing the Intifada. So people talk about how the global war on terror was a failure and all the different things that happened. I believe that's the case, but the failure wasn't just in Middle Eastern theaters abroad. It wasn't just Afghanistan. It wasn't just Iraq. It wasn't just Lebanon or Syria. The biggest failure is here at home. And you see, this is, again, I mentioned this before, this is why it's shocking to see hundreds, if not thousands of people out there in front of Fox News and elsewhere celebrating the massacre of 1,200 people from 2 years ago. Again, the largest massacre in the Western world since 9/11. And they're out there, Arabs, Muslims, leftists are out there celebrating it. But what was the big news that was shoved down young people's throats? It's coming from Candace Owens. Candace Owens and her speculation that the Jews are responsible for killing Charlie Kirk. So you see the different problems, getting around the news, getting around the noise, getting around propaganda. It's very important that we focus on what the actual problem here is in the United States, because it's been the same thing for a quarter of a century, even more. Again, walking along the Brooklyn Bridge with my boy, I see the I'm sure many of you know it, the Ari Halberstam Drive. What was that? That was from 1994, when Lebanese Islamists opened fire on a busload of Chabad kids. What was 1993? That was the first bombing of the World Trade Center. It's very important that people be aware of this, because if we talk about immigration, we talk about the people who must be deported, we talk about the people who can't be let into the country, we must have a very clear understanding of what that history looks like and what that actual threat is. It's extremely serious. And it's important that we keep that in front of us. And this is part of the strategy right now, to distract people by by screaming Jew, Jew, Jew at the top of their lungs. It's quite clear what's going on, and it's quite clear what the global threat is, and that's a very important thing, right, that we share with Israel.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Josh and Danny. I think this was a really important discussion. And again, I urge everybody to share it far and wide. I thank you all for taking the time to join us, and wish everybody a good afternoon. See you next month. Thank you all.